If you ever worked in a British factory, you knew the green machines. Herbert. The name was on a row of lathes in almost every workshop in the land, so common that a Herbert lathe was said to be as well known as a bottle of Bass. At its peak, the company was the largest machine tool maker in the world, with nearly 7,500 workers at a single Coventry works and agents in 57 countries. It armed Britain through 2 world wars. It came through the Depression, the Blitz that fell on Coventry, the death of the founder who had built it from nothing. It survived everything the 20th century threw at it. And then, after 95 years, the works fell silent, and the whole of it was sold off in 5 days. How does a company that survived all of that simply disappear? What really happened inside those walls?
Chapter 1. The Curly Chips. Coventry, in the last decades of the 19th century, was a city that had already learned to die and be reborn more than once. For generations it had lived on silk ribbon and watchmaking, delicate trades done by hand, in upstairs rooms where the light was good and the work was close.
Then the ribbon trade collapsed, undercut by cheaper weaving across the Channel. The watch trade followed it down, beaten by Switzerland and America. A lesser city might simply have faded. Coventry did something else. It looked hard at what its people were actually good at: fine work, close tolerances, clever and patient hands, and it bet everything on a new machine that was sweeping the country: the bicycle. By the 1880s, the streets around the old medieval core were filling with small workshops, turning out frames and wheels and the 100 small components a bicycle needs. The air smelled of oil and brazing flux. Fortunes were being made in sheds, and into this restless, ambitious, slightly chaotic city came a young man who had no business being there at all. His name was Alfred Edward Herbert. By rights, he should have been somewhere else entirely. He was born on the 5th of September, 1866 in Leicester, the son of William Herbert, a wealthy farmer, builder and landowner, the largest landowner in the parish of Whetstone, a man with a townhouse in a comfortable corner of Leicester for the winter months. This is the first thing to understand about Alfred Herbert, and it sits oddly against everything that came later. The man who would spend his life presenting himself as a living example of Victorian thrift and graft did not begin in poverty. He began with money, land, and every advantage a Midlands gentleman's son could expect. And what his family expected of him was the church. He was educated at Stonygate School in Leicester, where he excelled at English, science, and divinity. The plan was Oxford and then Holy Orders. A respectable, comfortable, predictable life. Alfred Herbert was destined for the pulpit. What turned him away from it was a single afternoon and a handful of metal shavings. He went to visit a school friend named William Hubbard, who was serving an apprenticeship at Joseph Jessup and Sons Crane and Hoist Builders in Leicester. And there, in the workshop, Herbert watched Hubbard working a small centre lathe, watched the cutting tool bite into a turning bar of steel and peel away a long, bright, curling ribbon of swarf. He never forgot it. Years later, an old man, he could still summon the feeling. He was, in his own word, spellbound to see the curly chips he was producing. That was all it took. Hubbard's achievements on the lathe were too much for me, he wrote, and I persuaded my father to let me follow his example. So the future clergyman became an engineer, not because of a sermon or a calling, but because metal looked beautiful coming off a lathe. A whole industrial empire, thousands of workers, 2 world wars, the green machines that would one day stand in nearly every factory in Britain, traces back to a boy watching curls of steel fall to a workshop floor. He became a premium apprentice at Jessop's in 1884, learning the trade properly, from the bottom. And here the privilege told again, quietly. A premium apprenticeship cost money, and Alfred's family had it. But the apprenticeship also did something privilege couldn't buy. It put him among working engineers, on a workshop floor, with oil under his fingernails, and it taught him a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. Alfred Herbert was never, by his own honest admission, a brilliant engineer. He could read a machine. He could sell one. But what he truly had, and what would matter far more than any talent at the bench, was an uncanny eye for the men who were brilliant, and the sense to get them working for him. He would need that eye soon enough, because in 1886, at the age of 20, he left Leicester and came to Coventry. Chapter 2. The Butts. He came as a manager, not an owner. His elder brother, William, was a director of a small jobbing engineering firm called Coles and Matthews, tucked away in Upper York Street, in the part of Coventry known as the Butts. They needed someone to run the place. Alfred took the job for £2 a week. It was an unglamorous beginning. Coles and Matthews made whatever came through the door, a bit of this, a repair of that, the daily improvised work of a small engineering shop, scraping a living in a boom town. But Alfred Herbert was watching and learning, and within 2 years he saw his chance. In 1888, the business was offered for sale. The price was £2,375. He didn't have it, but his family did, and so did Hubbard's. The two old-school friends, both Jessup apprentices, each had a father willing to put up £2,000 in capital. They bought the firm together and traded under both their names, Herbert and Hubbard. From the start, the work was wonderfully, hopelessly varied. They built ploughing tackle. They built steam rollers and boilers. They built machines for the ribbon trade, the very trade that was dying around them. And in 1889, they built something that has delighted everyone who has ever heard of it since, a machine for picking up and sorting pills. They took the name for the company badge from a memory of Alfred's school days. The Great Bell, Great Paul, which he had seen being hauled through the streets on its way to London. Great Paul became the firm's mark. It was a living. It was not yet an empire. What turned a jobbing shop into something far larger was, by Alfred Herbert's own cheerful account, an accident. And the accident was the bicycle. Coventry was building cycles by the tens of thousands, and every one of them needed lightweight, strong steel tube for its frame. Herbert secured the British selling agency for a French patent for weldless steel tubing, exactly the kind of tube the cycle makers were crying out for. His brother William's connections in the cycle trade, including a partnership with the great William Hillman, who would help found the Premier Cycle Company, opened the door. The tubing sold. It sold extraordinarily well, and the profits from that one agency gave Alfred Herbert the capital to do the thing he actually cared about, to build the machines that made things, rather than just the things themselves. As one economic historian put it, the company came into machine tool production by accident. The cycle boom paid for the lathes. This is the moment the story turns. A machine tool is not a glamorous object. Most people, if they are honest, could not say with any certainty what the words even mean. But the principle is simple, and it is the principle on which the entire modern world is built. A machine tool is a machine that makes other machines, or the parts of them. It is the lathe that turns the shaft, the borer that opens the cylinder, the cutter that shapes the gear. Every engine, every gun, every motor car and aeroplane that Britain would ever build began as raw metal shaped on a machine tool. Whoever controlled those machines controlled the foundation of industry itself. Alfred Herbert had decided, almost by chance, to make the machines that everything else depended on. But not with Hubbard. The two friends had bought the firm together, and the friendship survived. But the partnership did not. By 1894, it was over, and Herbert told the truth about it with characteristic plainness. After a time, he wrote, Mr. Hubbard and I came to the conclusion that, although our personal friendship was unimpaired, we were not suitable as partners. It was arranged that I buy his shares, which was done. No drama, no quarrel, simply two men recognizing that one of them needed to be in sole command, and they both knew which one. That year, the firm became a limited liability company, Alfred Herbert Ltd, capitalized at £25,000. Alfred's elder brother William was nominally the chairman, but no one was in any doubt about who ran the place. Alfred styled himself, with perfect accuracy, sole managing director. He was 28 years old. He had a name on the door, a city booming around him, and a clear idea of what he wanted to build. In 1887, the firm had employed 12 people. The years that followed would multiply that figure beyond anything the young man in Upper York Street could have imagined. Chapter 3. Green Machines. The single most important decision Alfred Herbert ever made was not a machine or a market. It was a man. In 1897, he hired a charismatic, blunt, brilliant Irish-American engineer named Oscar Harmer. Harmer walked into the ramshackle Upper York Street works, looked around at the place, and delivered his verdict in 5 words. There's a lot to do here. It was the beginning of a partnership that would define the company for the next 40 years. Harmer set the standards. Harmer drove the quality. and Harmer became, by every account that survives, one of the most gloriously memorable characters in the history of British engineering. The stories about him are half legend, but the legend tells you something true. He was said to be able to swear for 10 minutes without once repeating himself. He was known to take a sledgehammer to any machine he judged unworthy of leaving the works under the Herbert name, destroying his own company's product rather than let a customer receive something second-rate. He worked, fierce and exacting, until the last months of his life, and died in 1939 at the age of 89. And it was Harmer who brought in another of the great names, the designer P.V. Vernon, who would become one of the most celebrated machine tool engineers in Britain. Herbert had found the men who were brilliant, exactly as he'd always known he would. Together, they built the product that made the company's fortune, the capstan lathe. Now, Alfred Herbert did not invent it. The capstan and turret lathe had originated in the United States around 1840, and an early British example had been built by James Archdale and Company of Birmingham in 1884. Herbert was honest about this too. What the firm did was take the idea and perfect it, until a Herbert capstan lathe was the standard against which every other was measured. The genius of the machine was simple. An ordinary lathe needed a skilled turner to set up and change each cutting tool by hand. The capstan lathe carried its tools already mounted on a rotating head, a capstan, that brought each one to bear in sequence, against preset stops, so that a semi-skilled operator could turn out part after identical part, all day, at speed. It was the machine of repetition engineering. It was the machine that mass production was built on. The firm added the capstan lathe to its catalogue in 1895. The combination turret lathe followed in 1897, the single spindle automatic in 1903, and they were finished, every one of them, in a distinctive shade of green, a green that would, within a generation, become one of the most familiar sights in British industry. Walk into almost any factory in the country, from a great motorworks to a backstreet jobbing shop, and somewhere on the floor there would be a row of green Herbert machines, humming away. They became so utterly commonplace, so much a part of the furniture of working Britain, that men said a Herbert lathe was as well known as a bottle of Bass. It was the highest compliment an engineering product could be paid. It meant that the machine had stopped being a product and become simply part of the world, and the company grew on the back of it. The firm that had employed 12 in 1887 employed 180 by 1897. By 1908, it employed 1,400. Sales that had peaked at £29,000 in 1891 climbed past 300,000. Alfred Herbert was becoming a wealthy man and a powerful one, and he had not the slightest intention of behaving like a remote one. He was famous for it. He would come onto the works floor at all hours, especially on the night shift, cigarette in hand, and simply talk to whoever happened to be there, a fitter, a labourer, an apprentice 3 weeks into his time. His step-grandson would later recall that he treated every man as an equal. He kept a flat over the works for his weekly visits, even as he bought a country manor in Hampshire, with a trout stream for the fishing he loved. He was building a fortune and a reputation at the same time, and the two were beginning to feed each other. The green machines carried his name into every corner of British industry, and the name was starting to mean something. Chapter 4. The World's Workshop. There was a second idea behind Herbert's rise. Quieter than the green lathes, but every bit as clever. The company did not only sell what it made, it sold what other people made too. From the early 1900s, Herbert began acquiring the exclusive British and overseas selling agencies for other firms' machines. American ranges like LeBlond and Devleague, Norton grinding wheels, and many more. It built what it called its factored division, and the effect of this was something close to revolutionary for its day. A customer no longer had to go to a dozen suppliers to equip a workshop. He could come to Herbert and buy everything: the lathes, the borers, the grinders, the wheels, the small tools, the lot. Herbert could quote not just for a machine, but for a complete working factory, designed, supplied and installed. A one-stop shop, decades before the phrase existed. The boldest demonstration of this came in 1913, when the firm shipped an entire tooled-up factory, ready to run, to the Central Argentine Railways. Not a crate of machines, a factory. It was the kind of feat that announced a company had arrived not just nationally, but as a world power in its trade. And by that year, the map of Herbert's reach was extraordinary. There were branch offices across Britain, London, Birmingham, Manchester, Newcastle, Glasgow, Leeds, Bristol, and there were offices overseas in Paris and Milan, in Berlin and New York, in Calcutta and Yokohama. A Coventry firm that had begun by sorting pills now had an outpost in Japan. The irony of that particular address would not become clear for another 60 years. Behind all of it ran a steady current of invention. By the eve of the First World War, more than 60 machine and cutting tool patents had been granted to the firm. And here is the detail that tells you exactly who Alfred Herbert was. Of those 60-odd patents, only 2 stood in his name alone. All the rest were joint, shared with Harmer, with Vernon, with the engineers he had hired, precisely because they could do what he could not. He took out patents the way he ran his company, by finding the right men and binding their brilliance to his name. By 1914, the firm employed around 2,000 people, and on the eve of the war, Alfred Herbert Ltd accounted for something in the region of 42% of the entire output of Britain's leading machine tool makers. Nearly half. One firm. Then the war came, and it transformed Herbert from a great company into a national institution. Modern war is fought with machines, and machines are made on machine tools. A nation that cannot make shells, rifles, engines and shell casings in their millions cannot fight. And in 1915, as Britain reeled from a catastrophic shortage of munitions, the man the government turned to was Alfred Herbert. Lloyd George asked him to head the machine tool department of the new Ministry of Munitions. He became controller of machine tools, with near total authority over the supply of the machines on which the entire war effort depended. The boy who'd nearly become a clergyman was now one of the most quietly powerful industrialists in the country. He used that power in ways that ran against the grain of his time. The factories needed hands, and the men were at the front, and so Herbert campaigned, vigorously and against stiff resistance from the trade unions, for women to come into the munitions works and run the machines. And they came. Thousands of women, as the company's own histories recorded, came direct from their kitchens into factories, and after a week's training, they were standing at capstan and turret lathes, turning out the shells that fed the guns. The green machines that Herbert had made so familiar were now being worked by an entire generation of women who had never set foot in a factory before. It was, in its way, a quiet social revolution conducted in the name of the war. For all of it, Herbert was knighted in 1917. Sir Alfred Herbert, KBE. The honours piled up from grateful allies, the French Légion d'honneur, the Belgian Order of Leopold, the Russian Order of St. Stanislaus. A pill-sorting workshop in the Butts had become a firm whose founder was decorated by half the governments of Europe. By the time the guns fell silent in 1918, the shape of the thing was set. Alfred Herbert had built, almost from nothing, and almost, he liked to claim, by accident, the foundation of what would become the largest machine tool company in the world. He had the products, the green lathes that everyone knew. He had the global reach, the offices from New York to Yokohama. He had the men, the Harmers and the Vernons, and he had a name that now stood for British engineering itself. The summit was still ahead of him. So was the fall. But neither was yet imaginable. In the years after the war, the green machines kept rolling out of Coventry, and the company that bore his name kept growing, toward a peak so commanding that the men who inherited it would come to believe it could never end. Chapter 5. The Arsenal. If the First World War made Sir Alfred Herbert a national figure, the Second made his works a weapon. By 1939, the green machines had been the standard of British engineering for 40 years, and when the country went to war again, it was Herbert that the engineering of war leaned on. The principle had not changed since 1915. You cannot fight a modern war without the machines that make the guns and the shells and the engines and the 10,000 precision parts that go into an aircraft. What had changed was the scale, and the scale Herbert reached in those 6 years is almost difficult to take in. Between September 1939 and November 1944, 65,000 machines of every type were shipped out of the Herbert factories. 65,000, capstan lathes and turret lathes and automatics, going out to the shadow factories and the aircraft works and the shell-filling plants, the whole vast hidden machinery of a nation at total war. Every Spitfire that climbed to meet the bombers, every tank that rolled off a line, every shell that fed a gun, somewhere behind it, in the long chain of making, stood a green machine from Coventry. The works that had begun by sorting pills was now, in the most literal sense, arming the country. It grew to do it. A new small tools factory went up at Exhall. A great shadow factory was leased at Lutterworth, built with government money to disperse production away from the bombing, and later bought outright by the firm. Herbert was no longer a works. It was a constellation of works, spreading out across the Midlands, all of it pouring machines into the war effort. And once again, it was women who ran them. As in the First War, the men had gone, and the lathes still had to turn. So thousands of women came into the Herbert factories, many of them, the records say, direct from their kitchens, and after a week of training, they stood at the capstans in the autos and turned out the work of war. They were good at it. They were fast, and they were precise, and the green machines, which Sir Alfred had designed all those years before so that a semi-skilled operator could turn out part after identical part, were almost perfectly suited to hands that had never held a cutting tool before the war began. A whole generation of Coventry women learned engineering at a Herbert lathe. The recognition that came was of a kind few factories ever see. In August 1940, with the Battle of Britain raging in the skies, the King and Queen came to Edgwick. George VI and Queen Elizabeth walked the bays, through the smell of cutting oil and the roar of the machines, past the women at the lathes, to see for themselves the works that was helping to keep the country in the war. For a firm whose founder had once been bound for the parish pulpit, it was a long way to have come. And there is a final, telling detail from the very end of the war, one that says more about Herbert's standing than any statistic. In 1945 and 1946, when the fighting was over and the victors were dividing the spoils, Sir Alfred himself served on a British commission that toured the bombed-out machine tool factories of a defeated Germany. Their task was to go through the ruins, examine the German machines and drawings, and bring home whatever designs and innovations might be useful, the intellectual plunder of a beaten rival. It is worth sitting with the picture, because the wheel would one day turn. In 1945, a British commission picked over the wreckage of German engineering for ideas worth taking. Within 40 years, the traffic would run entirely the other way, but that lay far ahead. In 1945, Herbert stood at the absolute summit of its trade, an arsenal of the victorious nation, its green machines having armed Britain through the hardest war in its history. The works had proved itself. Now it would settle into its golden afternoon. Chapter 6. Through the Gates at Edgwick. The first building had risen on the Edgwick site back in 1899, an iron foundry built under Oscar Harmer's eye on flat land in the Foleshill district about a mile north of the old city. It was the seed of something enormous. Over the decades, that single foundry grew into the largest machine tool building factory in Britain and quite possibly in Europe. A sprawling industrial city of iron, bounded by the Foleshill Road and Stony Stanton Road, the Coventry Canal and Cross Road, covering acre upon acre of ground until more than 30 of them lay under roof. They called it the Head Works. The men who worked there simply called it Edgwick. Imagine arriving for the morning shift. You came in off the Foleshill Road into the stream of men converging on the gates, the sound of boots on the pavement and the half-shouted greetings, and you turned in through the entrance on Canal Road, the private road that ran straight through the heart of the site, dividing it. To one side lay the offices, the directors' rooms, the great drawing and design offices where men like Vernon laid out the machines, and Sir Alfred's own residential apartment, its keystone cut with the initials R. Arch, so there could be no mistaking whose works this was. To the other side, 2/3 of the whole vast acreage, lay the production, 30 main bays, each one 30 feet wide and 420 feet long, and running overhead, the whole length of them, 66 gantry cranes sliding back and forth on their rails, lifting castings that weighed anything from a single ton to 15. The scale of it took the breath away, but it was the senses that told you where you were. The smell came first, cutting oil, warm and heavy, and beneath it the sharper tang of hot swarf, the metal shavings curling off the lathes still carrying the heat of the cut. The same curling chips that had once stopped a Leicester schoolboy in his tracks, now produced by the 1,000 weight, every hour across 30 bays. Then the noise reached you, and the noise was a physical thing. Dozens upon dozens of capstan and automatic lathes running together, the bite of cutting tools, the rhythmic clatter of the autos cycling through their work, the overhead cranes rumbling on their tracks, the whole of it merging into a single vast industrial roar that ran day and night and never properly stopped. You could walk the making of a machine from one end of the site to the other, and men did, all day. It began in fire. In the main foundry, iron castings of up to 5 tons were poured in showers of sparks, the moulds packed in sand, the molten metal running white. There was a lighter foundry for the smaller work, and a separate bronze and aluminium foundry for the fittings that couldn't be iron. Before any of it, in the pattern shop, skilled men shaped the wooden patterns from which the moulds were taken, a trade in itself, the unsung beginning of every machine. The rough castings came out heavy and grey and approximate, and then they went to the machine bays to be made true, bored and faced and turned and ground, the surfaces brought to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, checked against the microscopic measuring machines that were themselves Herbert products. There was a chemical and physical laboratory where the metallurgy was tested, the steel proved, the hardness confirmed. And at the last came the erecting shops, where all the made and proven parts were brought together and the machine took shape, bed and headstock and capstan and gearbox, until it stood complete and was run, and was painted that unmistakable green, and was crated for a customer who might be in Birmingham or might be in Buenos Aires. And everywhere, in their ranks, the machines themselves, capstan and turret and precision screw lathes, single spindle automatics, cycling through their work untended, ball-bearing drilling machines, the self-opening die heads and the concentric chucks that carried the Herbert name, machines making machines in a green so familiar that a visitor might have failed to register it at all until he stepped outside the gates and realised he'd find the very same green in nearly every workshop in the land. By around 1960, nearly 7,500 people worked here. More than 3,350 machine tools were turning across the group at any one time. The cover of a visitor's booklet from the period put it without a trace of modesty and without much fear of contradiction. The largest machine tool organisation in the world. And it was the men and women who made it run. Not abstractions, people with names and trades and lifetimes given over to the green machines. Chapter 7. The Indentured and the Inherited. Consider the Bromleys. Their story runs through the works like a seam through rock, and it tells you what kind of place this was. Thomas Robert Bromley Jr. was apprenticed at Herbert's as a turner in 1896, one of the company's first generation. His indenture bound him for 7 years. He was paid 4 shillings a week to begin with, rising to 10 by the end of his time. 7 years learning to turn metal true, under men who would take a sledgehammer to anything that wasn't. 37 years later, he received his long-service certificate, and by then the next generation was already in. His son, Robert Carl Bromley, apprenticed in 1926, who rose through the company until, by 1961, he was managing director of Herbert's operations in India. A turner's boy on 4 shillings a week had fathered a man who ran the firm's business across a subcontinent. That was the promise the works held out, and for the Bromleys, it came true. It was not unusual. It was the pattern. Fathers, sons and grandsons followed each other through the Edgwick gates, and the works became something handed down within families like a trade or a name. The thread that bound them all was the apprenticeship, and the Herbert apprenticeship was famous. 7 years in the early days, later 5 for some trades. It was, men said, a passport to a job in engineering virtually anywhere in the world. A lad who had served his time at Herbert's could walk into a workshop on any continent and be taken on, because the green machines were everywhere, and the men who'd trained on them were trusted. At any one time through the middle of the century, 400 to 500 youngsters were in training at the works. The early indentures make remarkable reading. An apprentice was bound not to play at gaming nor enter into matrimony during his time. And from 1926, the binding went further still. He was not to be a member of a trade society, nor take part in any strike. That last clause was no accident, because it came straight from the founder. Sir Alfred Herbert was implacably, immovably opposed to trade unions. They were not officially recognised inside the company until after his death, though plenty of his men were quietly members all along, keeping it to themselves. He set down his views in a book he had privately printed in 1948, with the title Shots at the Truth, in which he exhorted his readers to work harder, practice thrift, and recognize what he called the evils of socialism and trade unionism. He believed it absolutely. And the strange thing, the thing that makes him so much more than a simple Victorian autocrat, is how it sat alongside a paternal generosity that was, by the standards of any age, genuinely extraordinary. They called it the Herbert spirit. It rested on the idea that the firm looked after its own. When a man was laid off in the lean December of 1930, the letter that came to him enclosed a voucher for a little English beef to be collected from a butcher in Cross Cheaping, so that his family would not go without at Christmas. When a fitter was convalescing from a breakdown, Lady Herbert sent round rabbits and chickens. These were not grand gestures from a distant boardroom. They were the small, particular kindnesses of a household, and the household happened to be a firm of thousands. The larger philanthropy was on a scale that reshaped the city itself. Sir Alfred gave Coventry Lady Herbert's garden and a set of almshouses, in memory of his second wife. He gave £20,000 toward rebuilding the Coventry and Warwickshire Hospital after the Blitz, and chaired the effort. He funded a camp for the city's poor children. He gave money toward the rebuilding of the cathedral itself. On his 90th birthday in 1956, he distributed £25,000 among his own employees. And above all, the gift that would outlast the firm, and his own name on a factory gate, he gave £200,000 in 2 instalments of £100,000 each toward an art gallery and museum for the people of Coventry. The works was woven into the life of the place at every level. It had its own fire brigade, the Alfred Herbert Fire Brigade, equipped as well as any in the city, one of whose engines survives in a Coventry museum to this day. The company funded the local amateur dramatic society and a whole constellation of sports clubs. In 1933, the city gave Sir Alfred its honorary freedom. The works was not merely a place where people earned a wage. It was, in the fullest sense, the centre of a world. When Sir Alfred died, and we will come to his death in its place, that world came to mourn him. It is worth knowing now what the people of Coventry felt about the man and the works, because it tells you the height from which the fall would come. At the memorial service, held in the bombed shell of the old cathedral and attended by more than 2,000, the bishop said something that stayed in the memory, that Sir Alfred had not regarded the men as his employees so much as his friends. And the next morning, the Coventry Standard ran a headline that caught the whole of it in a single line. The humble and eminent unite in a tribute to a man who was both. Chapter 8. As well known as a bottle of base. What did the green machines mean beyond the gates of Edgwick? What did the name Herbert signify out in the wider world? It signified quite simply that this was the standard. Through the first half of the 20th century, if you wanted to equip a workshop anywhere in Britain and in a great many places beyond it, you bought Herbert. The capstan lathe, perfected in Coventry, had become the workhorse of British repetition engineering, the machine on which countless other products were made. It stood in the motorworks of the Midlands, turning out the parts of the cars that carried the names Morris and Austin and Standard and Riley and Rover. It stood in the small jobbing shops down 100 back streets. The phrase that men used, that a Herbert lathe was as well known as a bottle of Bass, was not idle flattery. It meant that the machine had achieved the rarest thing a manufactured object can achieve. It had become invisible through sheer ubiquity. It was simply there, the way the floor was there, the way the works hooter was there, and the reach was global. By 1960, the company had grown to 4 factories and 5 subsidiary companies, with a total floor area of 1,427,000 square feet, better than 1.25 million square feet under management. There were 8 branch offices across Britain and associate companies in Australia, India, France, and Italy. Herbert had agents in 57 countries. The old genius of the factored division still ran through everything. The ability to supply not just a machine, but a complete working factory, designed and equipped and installed, the way it had once shipped an entire tooled-up works to the railways of Argentina. A customer anywhere in the world could come to Coventry with a manufacturing problem and leave with a solution. Its shares sat permanently in the blue-chip section of the London Stock Exchange, a fixture, a certainty, the kind of holding a cautious man bought for his pension and never thought about again. Through the rearmament that came with the Korean War in the early 1950s, the order books filled to bursting. The company could state, and did, that out of its own resources, it could supply virtually any type of machine tool or any complete manufacturing process required by any branch of the engineering industry, at home or abroad. It is worth holding that claim up to the light because it captures the moment exactly. Anything. To anyone. Anywhere. There was scarcely a manufacturing problem in the engineering world that a customer could bring to Coventry and not have answered. The order books were full, the delivery times were lengthening, and the future, as one historian of the company put it, looked entirely rosy. That was how it appeared from the inside, in the golden afternoon of the 1950s. The green machines rolled out of Edgwick by the thousand. The apprentices filed in 400 and 500 at a time. The name stood in blue-chip certainty on the stock exchange board, and a man who had given his working life to the firm, a Bromley, say, or one of the thousands like him, could look around the largest machine tool organisation in the world and feel, with complete justification, that he was part of something permanent, something built to last. And that would. He could not have known. None of them could have known. That hidden inside that very triumph, inside the full order books and the lengthening queues and the serene confidence of it all, lay the first quiet seeds of the thing that would, within a single generation, bring the whole of it down. Chapter 9. The Highest Point. The peak years ran through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, and they had the particular quality that all peaks have when you stand on them. They felt like a plateau. They felt like the natural and permanent state of things, rather than what they were, the highest point on a curve that had only one way left to go. By 1960, the numbers told a story of total command. 4 factories, 5 subsidiaries, more than 1.25 million square feet under roof, nearly 7,500 employees, over 3,300 machine tools turning at any moment, associate companies on 4 continents and agents in 57 countries, and the share price holding its serene place among the blue chips, where it had sat for so long that no one could quite imagine it anywhere else. There had been a moment, in those years, when British industry's own leaders presented Herbert with a plaque calling its newest facility the most impressive plant built in the country since the war. The firm displayed it, no doubt, with pride. It was the kind of recognition that confirmed what everyone inside already believed. And belief was the thing. Confidence, at the summit, had hardened into something more dangerous, a sense that the company's position was not earned afresh each year but simply was, like a fact of nature. The order books had always been full. They would always be full. The customers had always come to Coventry. They always would. Why, after all, would they go anywhere else? Where else in the world could you buy anything, to any specification, for any branch of engineering, from a single firm whose name had stood for quality across 2 world wars? This is the bittersweet heart of the whole story, and it must be said carefully, because the truth of it is crueler than any accusation. The full order books were not, as everyone read them, the proof of unassailable dominance. The lengthening delivery times were not the happy symptom of overwhelming demand. Seen from the far side of what came next, they were something else entirely. They were the first signs of a company that no longer felt any need to compete, on price, on delivery, on the relentless improvement of its product, because its customers had nowhere else to turn. The queue at the door was read as a triumph. It was, in fact, the beginning of complacency. As those who knew the industry would later put it, hidden in that very success lay the seeds of something they would come to call, with the bleak clarity of hindsight, illusions of invincibility. Because while the green machines rolled serenely out of Edgwick, and the people of Coventry served their 7 years and inherited their fathers' benches, and the share price held its blue-chip place, somewhere else, in workshops on the other side of the world, in the very country where Herbert had opened an office back in 1913, men were beginning to ask a question that no one in the Coventry boardroom thought worth taking seriously. What if the machine itself could think? These floors would one day fall silent. The cranes would stop on their rails. The roar that ran day and night would give way to a quiet that should never have been there. But not yet. In the golden afternoon of the early 1960s, with the order books full and the future looking entirely rosy, nobody inside those walls could see the cliff they were walking toward. They believed they stood on solid ground. They had, after all, always stood on solid ground. The ground was already beginning to move. Chapter 10. The question no one took seriously. Sir Alfred Herbert died on the 26th of May 1957 at the age of 90, in the way that suited him exactly, taking a glass of sherry at the house of his friend Tommy Sopwith in Hampshire. He had never formally retired. He had run the company, autocratically and almost single-handedly, for very nearly 70 years, from the partnership in the Butts to an empire of 7,500, and that was the first seed of the decline, though no one saw it as such at the time. Because a man who holds absolute power for that long, and never lets go of it, leaves behind a particular kind of wreckage. He leaves a company that has never learned to run without him. There was no succession. The talented men who might have led the firm into the new age had drifted away over the years to rivals, because there was no room at the top while Sir Alfred lived. The chairmen who followed him were good men and capable ones. There was Colonel Clark and the long-serving financial director, David Gimson. But none had the founder's authority, and none could fill the space he left. Years later, in the House of Commons, a member of Parliament would put it as plainly as it can be put. The curse of Alfred Herbert, he said, was the fact that the man who virtually owned the company held office for a long time, for far too long. It was a hard thing to say about a great man. It was also true, and while the company drifted in the years after his death, the question it should have been asking was being answered somewhere else. The question was this. For 2 centuries, a machine tool had been a thing of metal and skill, a lathe guided by the hands and eyes and judgment of a craftsman, a man who had served his 7 years and knew, in his fingertips, when the cut was true. But what if the guiding could be done by numbers? What if you could feed a machine a set of coded instructions and have it cut the part itself, the same way every time, without a skilled man standing over it at all? They called it numerical control. It had been born at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in the late 1950s, and one historian of the trade would call it the single most important advance in machine tool technology since the pioneers of the 19th century. It was, quite simply, the future. The machine had learned to think, and the British machine tool industry, Herbert foremost among it, looked at the future and laughed. The scorn is preserved in the record, and it is breathtaking in hindsight. Numerical control, the verdict went, was the brainchild of university-based electronics boffins working in ivory towers. Clever men, no doubt, but men who would not know a real machine tool if they tripped over one. This was the attitude. Real machines were made of iron by men who'd served their time. They were not made of wiring and code by academics who'd never cut a thread in their lives. There was a whole world of hard-won craft pride wrapped up in that contempt, and you can almost understand it. But it was the pride that comes before the fall, and the fall was already on its way. Even the smaller revolution went past them. Before full numerical control, there was a simpler idea, automating the ordinary capstan lathe with air cylinders and relays so it could run its cycle on its own. And the man who pioneered it in Britain was not Herbert, nor its great rival Ward. It was a subcontractor in Surrey named Ian Nichols, who automated his own lathes in his own shop using telephone exchange stepping relays, found it worked beautifully, and began selling do-it-yourself conversion kits to anyone who wanted them. An outsider in a small shop had seen the thing the giants of the trade had not. By the time the big builders noticed, he was already selling it. It was a small story, and an early one, but it was the shape of everything to come, the future arriving from somewhere other than Coventry, while Coventry assured itself that nothing fundamental had changed. Something fundamental had changed. And the place it had changed most was the country where Herbert had opened a branch office, in Optimism, in 1913. Chapter 11. The Leap Too Far. It would be wrong to say that Herbert never tried. That is the cruelest part of it. The company did try, and the way it tried became its own kind of tragedy. In 1968, at the Great International Machine Tool Exhibition at Olympia, Herbert unveiled something genuinely visionary. They called it the Turning Centre, a single machine that could perform all the operations of turning, and a great many besides, without ever removing the component, changing its own tools automatically from an onboard magazine. It was years ahead of its time. It was, in the words of the company's own historian, a quantum leap. Coventry had not been left behind by the future. Coventry had, for one bright moment, leapt out in front of it, and then nothing happened, because it was, as the same historian put it, a leap too far. British industry was not ready for such a machine. The orders did not come. Few were sold. The brilliant thing sat there, a glimpse of what was coming, and the company that had built it could not make it pay. Here is where the tragedy turns the knife. A decade later, barely 10 years on, the turning centre was a standard machine, an ordinary fixture of engineering workshops the world over, exactly as Herbert had foreseen. But it was no longer being built in Coventry. It was being built in the Far East and shipped into Britain and installed in British factories, while the company that had shown the world what it could do lay dying. Herbert had demonstrated the future at Olympia in 1968 and could not sell it. Then it watched another nation build that very future and sell it back into Britain. That nation was Japan. And while Herbert's boardroom dismissed the electronics boffins, Japanese industry had embraced them. A firm called Fanuc, the name is a contraction of Fuji Automatic Numerical Control, had been founded in 1956 under an engineer named Dr. Seiyuamon Inaba, and it had bet its entire existence on the proposition that the machine could think. By 1982, Fanuc had captured half the world market in numerical controls. Another firm, Yamazaki Mazak, was mass-producing numerically controlled machines and establishing factories abroad, including, by 1981, one in Worcester, in the English Midlands, less than 40 miles from Coventry. Japan had grasped the thing that Herbert refused to believe. It was first to put numerical control properly into its machines, and it built them in quantity, while the European and American firms stayed wedded to the old idea of the high-end, hand-finished, multi-function machine for the discerning customer. In 1982, Japan overtook the United States to become the world's leading producer of machine tools. It would hold that crown for 27 years. The warnings had been there, and they had been ignored for a very long time. As far back as 1960, an American professor named Seymour Melman had published a devastating critique of the European machine tool industry, and the British response, when it came, had to concede something damning, that the Western builders, as the phrase went, were only playing at the business. That was 1960. That was the very peak, the golden afternoon, the year of the visitor's booklet boasting of the largest machine tool organization in the world. The rot was being diagnosed at the exact moment the company felt most invincible. Nobody who mattered was listening, and over all of it lay the dead hand of government policy. The conviction in Whitehall, through the 1960s, was that British industry was too fragmented to compete, that the answer to foreign giants was to build British giants, by merger, whether the firms being merged wished it or not. Big, the thinking went, was beautiful. So the pressure came down on Herbert to grow, to consolidate, to absorb. And the company, drifting without its founder, with full order books that flattered its sense of strength, did as it was bid. The men who would make those decisions are about to step onto the stage, and the first of them was a man who would be knighted for his troubles, and whose every venture, in the bitter judgment of one observer, appears to have come unstuck.
Chapter 12. The Marriages That Failed. His name was Richard Young, Sir Richard Young after 1970, when the honour came for services to export. He was chairman and chief executive, and he was the man at the head of the company through the years when the fatal decisions were made.
He was not a villain. There were no villains in this story, only men under pressure, making choices that seemed reasonable in the room where they were made and proved catastrophic everywhere else. But the choices were his, and the trajectory they set was unmistakable. The first of them came in 1966. Picture the situation. The government wanted bigger British engineering firms. Herbert, the largest machine tool maker in the country, was the obvious nucleus around which to build. And so, in 1966, the machine tool and small tool interests of the great Birmingham Combine BSA, including the historic Churchill Machine Tool Company of Altrincham and BSA Tools of Birmingham, were merged into Herbert. The new entity was christened Herbert BSA. On paper, it was magnificent, a national champion, scaled up to face the world. In 1968, it even acquired BSA's numerically controlled technology, a thing called Batchmatic, a sign, perhaps, that someone understood where things were heading. It did not work. It did not work at the most basic human level, because the firms that had been forced together never truly became one. Each clung to its own identity, its own way of doing things, its own pride. Neither Churchill nor BSA ever properly integrated into the Herbert empire, and the empire itself grew, in the phrase the record leaves us, too big and too unwieldy for its time. The friction was real, and it was bitter, and it was personal. Churchill's own sales director, a man named Les Roberts, recorded the resentment with a sharp pen. When the combined firm won a Queen's Award for export, he noted that the chairman of Alfred Herbert received a knighthood, while the managing director of Churchill received nothing at all, and he remembered the board imposing pink uniforms on the shop floor staff, an order he cited as typical of a leadership hopelessly distant from the reality of the works. The marriage lasted 5 years. In August 1971, BSA sold its entire holding in the business and walked away, writing off £6.9 million in the process. The national champion had not been forged. A great deal of money and a great deal of goodwill had simply been destroyed. But by then, Sir Richard Young had already embarked on something far bolder and far more ruinous. In partnership with the Ingersoll Milling Machine Company of Illinois, which took 49% of the equity to Herbert's 51%, he built, on a greenfield site near Coventry, what was advertised as the most advanced machine tool factory in the world. And it was a wonder. It was windowless and temperature-controlled so that the precision of the machining would never vary with the weather. It was lit by more than 400 mercury lamps of 1,000 watts apiece. It used robots and wire-guided trucks that moved materials about the floor on their own. It covered 102,000 square feet, employed around 500 people, and opened in 1968 to general amazement. Its first great contract was to build a transfer machine, a vast automated line, to make cylinder blocks for Chrysler's car plant at Stoke, in Coventry itself. This was to be the jewel, the highest added value per man of anything in the group, a factory of the future serving the mass production car makers of the world. And then the world's car makers slid into recession. Almost as the doors of the brave new Daventry plant opened for business, the demand it had been built to serve began to evaporate. The great contracts did not materialize. After only about 4 years, the most advanced machine tool factory in the world was forced to close. The investment, £4.1 million, was simply lost, gone. The financial press had already taken Sir Richard Young's measure. As early as 1971, a magazine wrote of him, with devastating economy, that whatever he touched appeared to come unstuck, that profits had plunged to almost nothing, that the cash in hand had turned into an overdraft of £14 million, that Alfred Herbert shares had collapsed from 58 shillings to 6 shillings and 4p. And in the middle of all this, in 1970, the government had knighted him for services to export. It is one of the small, bleak ironies in which this story abounds. The honours came as the foundations gave way. Chapter 13. The Point of No Return. By the start of the 1970s, the company was bleeding, and it could not stop. The numbers tell the story with a brutal simplicity. Herbert made a loss in each of its last 5 years to 1974. By October 1975, the accumulated losses had reached £18 million. There was a debenture of £2.4 million. There was a loan of £6 million from the Finance Corporation for Industry. By October 1974, the bank overdraft alone stood at £7.9 million. The firm that had been a permanent blue chip, the certainty in a cautious man's pension, was drowning in debt, and the deepest cause was the simplest. The losses meant there was no money to invest, and without investment, the company could not modernize its own aging equipment, could not develop the new designs the world now demanded, could not catch the future that Japan had already caught. It was a trap that fed on itself. The Secretary of State for Industry would later describe it precisely in the careful language of government, a long period of financial stringency that had seriously inhibited the company's ability to maintain and modernize its own equipment and to develop new products. Read past the civil service phrasing, and it says this: Herbert was too poor to save itself, and getting poorer by trying. The human cost had already begun. Between 1971 and 1975, somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 jobs went. 8 factories were sold off. The workforce that had numbered around 12,000 across the enlarged group in the early 1970s fell to about 6,000 by 1975. Men who had served their 7 years, who had inherited their father's benches, who had believed they were part of something permanent, found that it was not permanent at all. The green machines were still rolling out, but fewer of them, and from a company that was visibly dying. It was at this point, with receivership a real and present danger, that the matter passed out of the boardroom and into the House of Commons, and the decision the government took there was the one that would define the company's final decade. In 1975, the Secretary of State for Industry was Eric Varley. The company had recently appointed a new acting chairman, John Buckley. The government's own Industrial Development Advisory Board had looked at Herbert's books and reached a clear recommendation: receivership, let it go. But that recommendation was overruled. Instead, the government chose to rescue the firm. Up to £25 million of public money would be made available, mostly as equity, with the bank overdraft guarantee raised from £5 million to £15 million. The equity would be vested in the new National Enterprise Board. The company would be renamed simply Herbert Ltd. And so, on the 9th of July 1975, the House divided, 110 in favour, 74 against, and one of the great names of British private enterprise passed, in effect, into the ownership of the state. The arguments made against it that day have a terrible prescience. Michael Heseltine rose to say that this was a company that had failed in the most material ways, and that a very substantial responsibility for letting the position deteriorate lay with the owners and shareholders. Another member, John Stanley, made a sharper point still, that of the 25 million, more than 20, would do nothing but repay the creditors and the banks. It would not secure a single job, only settle old debts. And Cecil Parkinson predicted, correctly, that this would not be the last time the taxpayer was asked to fill the hole. The case for the rescue was real too, and it should be heard. Herbert was still one of the largest machine tool makers in the country and one of its biggest exporters. It employed around 6,000 people across 9 plants, from Rotherham to Falmouth, and it was vital to the re-equipping of British Leyland, itself a ward of the state. There were genuine reasons to try to save it. But the brutal truth, visible even at the time to men like Stanley, was that the money bought time, not viability. The disease had not been treated. It had only been refinanced. The eventual total the state poured in would dwarf the 25 million authorised that day. The company's historian records that the National Enterprise Board ultimately invested at least £57 million. The government would come to own more than 90% of the equity. And at the end of all of it, every million, every guarantee, every refinancing, the company would still die. The only question left was how, and when, and how much would be lost along the way. Chapter 14. The Last House Journal. There is a small thing that happened in January 1970, before the worst of it, and it tells you more about the mood inside the company than any balance sheet. The Herbert News, the company's house journal, 8 pages, published without a single break for 43 years, was discontinued, a cost saving, a small one. But in its final issue, the deputy managing director, a man named Norman, wrote something that reads now like an epitaph the company composed for itself without knowing it. With world competition fiercer than ever, he warned, it was becoming increasingly important to deliver on time. The overseas customer, he wrote, wanted his machine to arrive on the day they said it would arrive, and to work perfectly, first time, when he pressed the button. He was right. That was exactly what the customer now wanted, and it was exactly what Japan had learned to provide, and what Herbert, with its lengthening delivery times and its aging designs, increasingly could not. The deputy managing director saw the cliff. He named it, in the last words of the last issue of the company magazine. And then the magazine stopped, and the company walked on toward the edge. Through the late 1970s, the decline went on, slow and inexorable. There was vicious cost-cutting. There were round after round of redundancies. The flood of imports, the very turning centres Herbert had pioneered, now built in the Far East, left the company further behind with every passing year. And then the political weather changed. The government that came to power in 1979 did not believe in propping up failing firms with public money. It saw the National Enterprise Board's role in companies like Herbert as backdoor nationalisation, and it meant to end it. The 1980 Industry Act restricted the board to what it called a catalytic role, a polite way of saying it would no longer pour money into bottomless holes. And in July 1980, the board refused Herbert any further funds. That was the end, though it took 2 more years to finish. The high-technology systems part of the business was sold to the electronics giant GEC. In October 1980, the company went into voluntary liquidation. A firm called Tooling Investments took over the bulk of what was left. The BSA division, with its product range, was sold to White Consolidated Industries of the United States. The new owners did what new owners do. More redundancies, some new machines launched in hope, the surviving manufacturing pulled back into a smaller corner of the great head works that had once held 7,500. They tried. And then, 2 years on, the unthinkable finally happened. The new owners conceded defeat. The receivers were called in. It was 1982. The debt stood at around £17 million. The end, when it came, was quiet and orderly, and almost unbearably sad. In October 1983, the entire contents of the Edgwick Works were sold at auction. Everything, from the highest value machine tools down to the tin waste paper baskets. It took 5 days, and it was conducted, for the most part, in a single one of the great production bays, Bay 26. The auctioneer stood where the cranes had once rumbled overhead and sold off, piece by piece, the contents of the largest machine tool organization in the world. It is believed to have raised around £750,000. The whole of it. £750,000. And at the time of that auction, the number of people still employed by Alfred Herbert had fallen to 400. 400. It is worth letting that number find its place against the others. 7,500 at the peak. 6,000 at the rescue. 400 here at the end, in Bay 26, among the waste paper baskets. It was very nearly the exact number the firm had employed in 1894, when a 28-year-old Alfred Herbert had turned his workshop into a limited company. The wheel had come all the way round. 95 years, and the works ended with the same few hundred souls it had begun with, except that in 1894 the number was a beginning, and in 1983 it was an end. Coventry felt it as part of something larger and crueler. The city's manufacturing employment had stood at 115,000 in 1975. By the end of 1982, it had fallen to 62,000, very nearly cut in half in 7 years. The collapse of Alfred Herbert, once the biggest machine tool firm in the world, was the brutal centerpiece of that decline. The city's own historians would record that as the machinery was sold off in a dead factory where thousands had worked, Coventry took on what they called a bleak and dispiriting feel. A ghost town. And the word was the right one, because Coventry's most famous musical export had already put it to a tune. The Specials had released Ghost Town in June 1981, and it had gone to number 1 that July, and stayed there for 3 weeks. It was about exactly this, a Midlands industrial city watching its working life close down around it. The men leaving Bay 26 for the last time in 1983 walked out into the city that song was written about. Chapter 15. The Silent Ground. What happened to the 400, and to the thousands who had gone before them? Some found other work. Coventry still had engineering, for a while yet, though less of it every year. But the city was losing its great machine tool firms all at once. Not just Herbert, but the others of what had been called the Big Four, A.C. Wickman, Coventry Gage and Toole, Webster and Bennett. As each one fell, a particular kind of loss occurred that no retraining scheme could repair. Some of the older and most highly skilled men, the ones who had served their 7 years, who knew in their fingertips when a cut was true, who carried in their hands a craft that had taken a lifetime to acquire, were destined never to work again. The skill simply had nowhere to go, and when those men retired or died, the skill died with them. A priceless national resource, built up over the better part of a century, was lost forever. Not one of the Big Four's factories still stands. The trade that Herbert had once dominated passed, completely and permanently, to others. Japan, having taken the crown in 1982, held it for 27 years. Germany rose alongside it, with firms like Trumpf. In time, China would come to dominate the world's machine tool production, with Germany and Japan its nearest rivals, the very lineages that had displaced Herbert. As for the country that had once made 42% of all the leading British output, that had shipped a complete factory to Argentina, that had armed itself through 2 world wars on its own green machines, the United Kingdom no longer appears in the top 10 of world machine tool production on any measure that matters. The industry that Coventry had carried did not decline. It departed. And the works itself? The 35-acre Edgwick site was bought in the late 1970s by a property firm, its very first commercial investment. By 2014, a man who knew the place could write that nothing of any significance whatever remained of the Edgwick Works. The great bays were cleared. Large sections of the ground were given over to a retail park and to a Lidl supermarket. The last surviving structure from the Herbert era, a building they had called the Top Shop, was finally cleared around 2017 to make way for small industrial units, where the foundries had poured 5-ton castings in showers of sparks, where the cranes had run their rails the length of bays 420 feet long, where 7,500 people had once made the machines that made the modern world. There is now a car park, a supermarket, and a row of light industrial sheds. Stand on that ground today, and there is nothing to tell you. No roar that ran day and night, no smell of cutting oil, no green machines in their ranks. The particular silence of a place built for noise has settled over it completely, and the people who pass through with their trolleys have no reason to know that they are walking across the floor of what was once the largest machine tool organization in the world. But the name did not die with the works. That is the strange grace of this story, because the gift Sir Alfred Herbert made in his lifetime, the £200,000 for an art gallery and museum for the people of Coventry, outlived everything else. The Herbert Art Gallery and Museum opened in 1960, 3 years after his death. His widow Nina performed the opening. It was refurbished and reopened in 2008, and within a few years it was drawing hundreds of thousands of visitors a year. The factory is gone, the green machines are scattered to collections and to the few workshops where they still remarkably turn. But the name Herbert still stands over a door in Coventry, not the door of a works, but the door of a place where the city keeps its art and its memory. The philanthropy outlived the firm. The eulogist could ask for no kinder ending than that. Chapter 16. The Curly Chips. There was a boy once in a workshop in Leicester who was meant to be a clergyman. He went to see a friend at his work, and he watched a cutting tool bite into a turning bar of steel, and he saw the bright metal peel away in long, curling ribbons, and something in him changed forever. He could not explain it, except to say that he was spellbound by the curly chips. He persuaded his father to let him follow his friend onto the lathe. And from that single afternoon, from a boy's delight in the way metal came off a machine, there grew a company that armed Britain through 2 world wars, that put a green lathe in nearly every workshop in the land, that became, for a time, the largest of its kind in the world. It did not fall because of war, or depression, or any disaster from outside. It survived all of those. It came through the Great War and the slump that followed it, through the Depression, through the Blitz that fell on Coventry, through the Second World War, through the death of the founder who had seemed to be the company itself. It survived everything that the world threw at it. What it could not survive was its own success, the full order books that felt like triumph, the lengthening queues that felt like dominance, the serene certainty that the customers would always come, because where else, after all, would they go? It could not bring itself to believe that the future belonged to a thing made of wiring and code by men who'd never cut a thread, until that future had been built and sold and shipped into Britain by another nation, while the company that had glimpsed it first at Olympia lay dying. The thing that killed Alfred Herbert was not a wound. It was a refusal to believe that the world had changed. The works is a supermarket now. The men who served there 7 years are old or gone. The green machines are quiet, and somewhere in the city, behind a door that still carries his name, hang the pictures that a Leicester landowner's son, who was supposed to be a vicar and became an engineer because of the way the chips curled off a lathe, gave to the people of Coventry, so that something of him would last. Something of him does,